Hello Year 9 and welcome to Lesson 13 of our War and Conflict Poetry unit, and today we are going to start introducing the idea of comparison because this is what you will be ultimately doing in your final assessment. So we've just looked at two similar poems in terms of the fact that they're about the psychological injuries of war, although they were written many years apart. So we're going to start working on building comparisons between these two poems today. So your do now activity is sentence expansion, which we've done lots of times before, but this time your sentence expansion is building those comparisons. So your expansion word is whereas and both. So you need to write out these sentences and add to them. Mental cases deals with psychological damage of war, whereas, and both mental cases and the manhunt. Then you need to finish off. So one's obviously looking at differences and one's looking at similarities. So pause video here, have a go at writing your answers to those questions, and then press play when you're done. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time looking and expanding on those similarities and differences between the two poems. One way we can do this is through a diagram like the one above. So on the one side, we've got the poem Mental Cases, and on the other side, we've got Manhunt, and we've got those two circles overlapping. So that bit in the middle is going to be where we put our similarities. So we're going to make some notes on what happens in mental cases and the techniques and the methods used by the author. And on the other side, we are going to put everything about Manhunt that we remember in terms of methods and what the poet has to say. And in the middle, we're going to put any bits that cross over between the two poems, so any similarities between the two poems. So just as a recap then, the large area of the circle is for the differences between the two poems, and the crossover are the similarities between the two poems. Now this is going to involve you going back to your poems and the work that you've done previously. So I want you to pause the video and spend about 10-15 minutes on this activity, and really make sure you think about those similarities and differences before you press play to move on. Okay, so two poems that are very similar in terms of their content, written very differently, lots of years between the two poems. So we're going to look at how we might organise and build our comparisons. So we've had that brainstorming activity where we've looked at everything we can remember about both the poems in terms of their similarities and differences. And what we're going to do now is organise that information into these three different areas, which is effectively the what, how and why. So we're going to think about the content or the message or attitude of both poems, the form, so the rhythm and rhyme and the way that they've been structured, and language use, so we're looking at methods there. So what I'd like you to do now is to draw out a grid like the one in front of you, and I'd like you to organise your notes now across the grid. So the first thing we're thinking about is, what is the message or the attitude of Wilfred Owen in Mental Cases? What's he got to say about the idea of psychological damage? And then what's the message or the attitude in the Manhunt? How is Mental Cases written? How is the Manhunt written? What's interesting about language in Mental Cases? What's interesting in the Manhunt? And then you've got a box at the bottom for key lines or quotes that really stand out from the poem to you. So again, we're going to spend about 10 minutes completing this grid, ready to start building our comparative paragraphs. Pause the video here. So we're going to have a little bit of a go at answering this question. We're not writing a full essay today, we're just writing a comparative paragraph, and we're going to look at how the damage of war is presented in Mental Cases and the Manhunt. Now, when we are writing comparative paragraphs, we always need to begin with a comparative sentence. So this is like what we did at the very beginning of the lesson. So it might be a both comment, or it might be a whilst comment. So we've got, in this case, my example is both poems deal with the psychological effects of war. So I am using a similarity there between the two poems, and I'm starting my paragraph with a clear statement of similarity between the two poems. You then need to develop this with further information about each poem individually and using your quotes. So you're very used to writing what statements, and this is effectively now your what statement, but about each poem in turn. So for example, both poems deal with the psychological effects of war. However, Mental Cases explores the psychological damage of the men whose minds the dead have ravished, whereas The Manhunt explores both the physical and psychological effects of war, as his wife traced the scarring back to its source, to a sweating and exploded mine buried deep in his mind. So you can see what I've done there is I've built on my comparative opening sentence by adding in the what about each of the poems. And what I've actually done here is suggested that while they both deal with psychological effects of war, they are slightly different. That Mental Cases is only really about the psychological damage, whereas Manhunt looks at psychological and physical damage. We're then going to build on this by adding something about form and language. So in the same way as you've done with your what, how, why paragraphs in previous lessons, you're now going to develop those. So you would now say something about the way Mental Cases was written and the way Manhunt was written. So, as I said before, we are removing the scaffolding a little bit so that you can have a go at this a little bit more independently each time. So your only task for the rest of today's lesson is to have a go at writing a what, how, why paragraph, comparative paragraph, comparing Mental Cases and the Manhunt, and looking at the way the damage of war is presented in both of those poems. So it's over to you now for the rest of this lesson. And when you've finished this work can be submitted to your class teacher. If you have any problems with this, make sure you ask, because this is going to be picked up again as we get on to your final assessment for this unit. So have a go, 10-15 minutes on this, and then you're finished for today, and I will see you next time. Until then, take care.